Hey everyone, happy Friday. So, have you ever gone to your doctor with a complaint or a symptom? They run blood work, and then when it comes time to get your results, you either see in the portal or they tell you that everything is normal. So, what I'm going to chat about in the next few minutes has to do with ferritin and reference ranges. And the reason you're being told that your values are normal is because your clinician is relying upon reference ranges to tell them whether or not your results fall within the normal range. But circling back to my favorite little molecule of the month, ferritin, it has an interesting story and is the center of some debate currently regarding its reference ranges. So ferritin, like I talked about yesterday, is one of the body's primary iron storage molecule. And it's not present in red blood cells, but it's present in like the bone marrow, the liver, the spleen. And also, don't forget about the brain, but that's talk for another time. Primarily bone marrow, liver, spleen. But the reference range for this important little molecule is 5 nanograms per milliliter to 204 nanograms per milliliter. Like, just stop and think about that huge variation, that big wide reference range of what is considered normal. So, like, if I see somebody with a ferritin in the single digits, I am replacing their iron quickly. Like, they are severely iron deficient. So, fun little aside. So, squirrel here, but fun little aside about ferritin. So, as I said before, it represents like bone marrow stores of iron, like what we keep in our secret stash to use to make more red blood cells as our red blood cells die and are recycled out. But anyhow, it's very important that we have iron in our bone marrow. The gold standard for determining a person's iron stores is a bone marrow biopsy, where they aspirate some of the marrow and they put it under a slide and they stain it for iron and they see how much is actually in there. Obviously, we're not going to be doing bone marrow biopsies to figure out if people are iron deficient, but they've done studies where they take people and they measure their ferritin and then they get a bone marrow biopsy and see how much iron they have in their marrow. And at least one study that I know of, and the WHO uses this standard, that people with ferritin of 30 or below can reasonably assume to have close to zero iron stores in their marrow. So I routinely see people with ferritins in the single digits, especially pregnant women. Not uncommon. And folks with a ferritin of 30 or below are highly likely to have zero iron stores in their bone marrow. That's crazy. So anyway, where did they get this insanely wide reference range for ferritin? Well, the same way they got a lot of reference ranges, I think. And I don't know the specifics for ferritin, but oftentimes what they did was they would go to college campuses and recruit healthy young men and women in their early 20s. They would draw their blood, run the test, tabulate all the data, and use statistics to determine what is a reasonable reference range. So if half of them are males and half of them are females, ideally, what we know now is a lot of them just use men. I don't know for ferritin. Honestly, I don't know. But assuming that there was a sizable proportion of women in that sample size, they were just deemed healthy. They're like, if they're young men and women going to college and learning and paying tuition and taking tests and walking to class, then they represent some of the healthiest people around. Well, we know now that so many women are iron deficient and or anemic that they weren't obviously screening out iron deficiency or anemia before they used these people to determine the reference ranges. They were just drawing their blood because they're like, these are healthy people. Especially, too, the understanding of iron deficiency at that time was largely limited to, are they anemic? And as we talked about in my first video, there's a difference between anemia and iron deficiency. You can have both. You can have iron deficiency without anemia, which is what I ended up having, but more on that later. So it can be assumed that a large proportion of the female participants were iron deficient at baseline, and then their values are being used to calculate the reference ranges. Super interesting. So now, what I'm not saying that if you are told your laboratory values are normal to automatically think that the reference ranges are bogus, but it's just something to think about. And in regards to iron, I really look at the person in front of me, right? The ferritin in the single digits is never normal. Where it gets a little more tricky to decide whether or not to give somebody iron is when they're, close to or hovering around 100. And it really does depend on what their main complaint is. Like, what are they seeing me for? So I will post a little bit more. I plan to circle back around hair loss, primarily in perimenopause and menopause, so stay tuned. Comment below if you have any questions. I enjoyed getting some questions and comments from y'all earlier, so thank you so much.